Thanks for joining us for another season of the Brethren Way podcast. Please enjoy this episode of the Calling series, hosted by Brethren Church Director of Pastoral and Congregational Vitality, Miles Larson.
Welcome, Brethren podcast listeners. This is Miles Larson. I am the host this season, season 3 of the Brethren Way podcast. And in this season, we are talking about calling and how our pastors and church leaders get a sense of their call into ministry and into living a life that is on point with the mission that God has put before them. And today, we are blessed to have 3 folks with some history, at least, at Mount Olive Brethren Church in Virginia. We have Fred and David Miller and Melanie, who is now the pastor at Liberty Brethren Church. And folks, I'd love to start by just getting kind of the quick version of how you find yourself in this role. How did you find yourselves being called into vocational ministry? And we'll start with Fred. How did you get here? What happened? Who were some key voices? Who played a role in that?
Well, I grew up in a home where my mother and father both went to church regularly. It's Brush Valley Brethren Church. At that church, we had a pastor by the name of Tom Kidder. And Tom Kidder was always going up to every young boy in the congregation and saying, "You're going to be a pastor someday. You're going to be a pastor someday." And every now and then it would stick. It stuck with his future son-in-law, Earl Chrisman. It stuck with my cousin, Daryl Chrisman. I really didn't want to go into pastoral ministry. I wanted to go to Florida, mow lawns, and spend time at the beach. That was my dream.
Yeah.
And then one evening in May of 1976, shortly before I graduated, God came calling, and I call it my wrestling match with God, like Jacob wrestled with God. I wrestled with him all night long. I did not want to continue school. I did not want to go into pastoral ministry. I threw everything out of my head, and he always came back with a good response, as God would do. And so next thing I know, it's morning, the sun is rising. And I said, all right, you get me into a school and I will follow this call you're giving me. And I got into 3 schools, ended up going to Penn State University, the National Theological Seminary, fell in love with school, fell in love with reading and learning. And I knew immediately what my call was. My call was into pastoral ministry. I was going to be a pastor of a church. And so that's my call in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's great. I have a lot of things I could say about that, but I'll hold on to them for a second at least. David, how about you?
Yeah, I was born and raised Brethren. My dad was working towards becoming a pastor, and when I came into this world in 1982, and so I've had a front row seat to the Brethren Church since the day I was born. I heard God call me to teach and preach to his people when I was 16, and then I proceeded to spend the next 16 years ignoring that call.
Yeah.
Going every different direction I could without following that call. And then my father came to me and he said, "Hey, listen, the Brethren Church is offering a reading program. It's a 5-year reading program. You become an ordained elder of the Brethren Church." And I just felt God telling me, "Listen, this is your last chance. Like, you can either do what I've called you to do or I'll find somebody else." And so I took that step, took the reading course, finished that up. And about the time I finished that up, the youth position here at Mount Olive opened up, and I applied for that and got the job. And I guess the rest is history after that. So
yeah, that's great. It's awesome. Melanie, how about you?
I would say that when I was about 11 or 12 years old, I didn't know necessarily ministry. I always loved people, and I went into nursing homes a lot. And I thought that I was going to be a nurse. And so I went to college, and then I realized, well, I can't do math. And so my sister said, what about chaplain work? What about chaplaincy? And so I started looking into that. And so then I started volunteering in hospice. And then I did hospital work. And then Pastor Fred's class, the reading class, came along. And another lady who was in the class with me said, "Melanie, have you thought about that?" And I knew immediately when she said that that's where God was calling me to go. Even they had already started the class a little bit, but I got in there. And then, even for a long time, I wasn't exactly sure where God was leading me to the ministry, because I would have never thought head pastor myself. I always thought chaplaincy. But then God always opens doors and he surprises everybody. And so I knew that God was calling me to love people. And I think in any kind of ministry, we can love people. And so I just feel honored that God allowed me to do that. So through the reading class with Fred was one of the first steps.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's such a good sort of segue to what we want to talk about today. This is my opinion. You guys can all say I'm wrong, but it seems to me that historically, Fred's call seems like what I've always heard about, right? There's somebody in the church that you grow up in that says, hey, you should be a pastor. Hey, you should be a pastor. Hey, you should be. And I like that Fred said it doesn't always stick, but sometimes it did. And I think that there is that when I travel around the country and I see churches, we seem to be missing some of that identifying gifts in our younger people, our younger leaders, men and women, and calling them out and then encouraging them and empowering them and resourcing them and training them. And so I think there are a couple reasons. One, I think that we've deeply leaned into this idea of vocational ministry as full-time, and you have to be trained and you have to go to seminary and all these things. It's not an indictment on that system. It's just the system that was. But it seems to me that we've forgotten that the local church is really the primary disciple maker, that it's really through the local church and the local pastorate that we find other pastors. We make people who make disciples. And Mount Olive has seemed to be a bit of an anomaly in that. So maybe I'm talking to the wrong crowd about this, but when I look around at churches, that doesn't seem to be happening as much anymore. There was a season when you could call the national office and Cooksey had a little file of pastors and he could just, pull one out and be like, here's a guy or a gal for you. I don't have that anymore. That is not a real thing. When we look around the denomination, we see a lot of folks that have come in from other denominations, that some that are close to us, some that are wildly different than the brethren. And so we have this need in the brethren church to go outside of the local congregations to resupply our pastorate. We'll start with, am I crazy in my understanding of how we got where we are? Does that resonate with you folks, or have I misinterpreted things?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that we are a much smaller denomination now than we used to be. And we're maybe an older denomination than we used to be.
Yep.
And so there are not as many young people, maybe, in many of our congregations that are there to hear the call. So if you've got a congregation that's 60 and up, I don't know that you're going to have many people who respond. I think also, ministry is not an easy thing to do.
Right.
Now that Melanie and David are in it, they realize, your weekend is not your own anymore. And people travel more and camp more than ever before. And there's a great sacrifice to be made there. On Sunday morning, you and your family are going to be in church. And so are we willing to make the sacrifice that is necessary to pursue this call and to go into ministry? You mentioned bivocational ministry. That's not easy either. You've got a job, you've got a family, and you got to get a message ready every Sunday. And Melanie's probably closer to that than David and I, because she does other things, has a large family, and preaches on Sunday morning. And her calendar during the week is really full. That's not an easy thing. Melanie was willing to hear that and respond to that call. And now she's at liberty. And, it brings a pastor like me this great honor and pleasure to see people who grew up in this congregation go into ministry. So I think there are a lot of variables there, but, are we developing leaders in our congregation who are willing to step into this kind of role and be pastors? And clearly you have no list, so it's not being done.
Right. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And you have, every generation kind of has to figure out what the Brethren Church is going to look like to them. And this is no knock on the Brethren Church, because I love the Brethren Church, but there hasn't always been a safe place for young people to do that. There hasn't been a place for them to kind of figure out, well, what's this church going to mean to me and my generation? Now, Mount Olive, they've been a church that has always been willing to allow people to figure out what this looks like, and see the change that goes through the church. And it can be difficult to have young people get excited about leading something that they don't feel like is theirs. It becomes almost like just going through the motions of coming to church on Sunday, because maybe your leadership is afraid to let you have any leadership because maybe they're afraid of some kind of failure or mess up or something like that. when in reality, that's really the only way we can move forward is, okay, that didn't work. Let's try something different. And so I do believe we have young people and have had young people in the Brethren Church who would make or maybe are currently great leaders, just didn't have necessarily the atmosphere to build what they built before. Yeah, we are a smaller denomination, but working with the youth the last 7, 8 years, I've seen the Brethren Church begin to pour more into their youth, well, I think, which will pay dividends later as we're looking for leaders, as long as we can continue that pursuit of allowing them to figure out, okay, how am I taking the brethren to this generation and giving them a safe space to do that?
Yeah, I agree. I like what David said, because when I started Mount Olive, I was probably 9, 10 years old, I think, because I was there for 17 years. And being at church, being at Mount Olive, I wanted to be there all the time. And I even remember telling one of the secretaries sometimes, I was like, isn't this the greatest job in the world that you get to be at church all week? And she's like, well, I'm working. But I remember having that feeling, just being so young and being in the church. And of course, I think where God was calling me, but like I remember some of Fred's sermons and some of the things that he would say, and I would get very excited about that. And I think David's totally right about that, is that we have to be able to meet the needs of the kids. And here at Liberty, when we have new teenagers come, we have new kids come, I tell my own children, I said, the people who are going to make them feel the most loved is you. I can do whatever I want, say whatever I want. I said, but we need to build a community so that way they not only feel welcomed by me, but also by you, their peers. And we need to lead them to know who Jesus is. And we have to meet them there. We can't just, say hi to them and then bye or whatever, but we need to find out what their needs are, pray with these kids, and teach them how to be leaders within the Brethren Church and to be able to follow Christ as he calls us to be. So, and I think what Fred did with the classes, he did so much follow up with all of us, and he sat there with us and he taught us. And even if we weren't sitting in the class with him, like I can see my whole young life watching Fred. And what did Fred do? And even till this day, my kids go, Mom, you just did a sermon like Fred said, or you just said what said for Fred to do. And I said, well, who do you think my teacher was? Yeah. And so I think that's so important for us to, as pastors, as leaders, to lead these kids in that way.
Yeah, Melanie, that's so good. And I'd love to hear from, again, you three have all spent some time at Mount Olive, and either under Fred's leadership or as Fred. What does it look like practically? Again, you're right, Fred. You have more young people than many of our churches, but there's only 3 of you on here. We have another 10 people that we could have had on this call, right? That have come through, that are doing great things in the Brethren Church and elsewhere because of the culture that has been built there. Fred, from your perspective as maybe the culture builder, and then the other 2 as sort of culture participants, what did that culture look like? How do you build it? What goes on in your head? What goes on at Mount Olive that is so different than so many other churches?
Well, again, I think growing up in a culture where I had a pastor who looked at people and said, you could go into ministry, planted a seed in my heart. And so, we have a Jason Barnhart who went into ministry, went to the national office, and now it's at the seminary. The first round of the reading program, I had just graduated with my doctor of ministry degree in transformational leadership at the seminary. And transformational leadership wasn't just about me being transformed, but about other leaders like David and Melanie being transformed in their life and giving them opportunity. And so I felt this call, being on the National Board of Ordination at that time, and having watched people come through, I thought, we can take people through the reading program. In fact, my pastor, Reverend Kidder, didn't go to seminary. He came out of the steel mill having gone through the reading program himself. So I offered it, and we had 13 people respond. 6 of those people hung in there through the end. And that was David, Gail Heaston, Melanie, Tracy Shiflett, Heather Myers, who went into youth ministry here for 7 years, and Brad Earhart, who helped with our campus at Timberville. And we had that for a year and a half and has been our church moderator the last 6 years. So I could see with Gail and Heather on staff at that time, because our church was growing, we needed an office manager / associate pastor and a youth pastor. With those 2 on staff, I thought, let's look at getting these people licensed and going toward ordination. That opened the door to saying to the congregation, if there is anybody else who is interested in this, come get your feet wet and see if this is for you.
Yeah.
And they did. And so 6 of those went through it. Not all those were young people. Gail was in her early, probably 50s at that time. I've got a new class. We just started last night, our kickoff. And Pete's in his 50. Daryl just turned 50. Then I have Nate Riddle. Laura Waldron is my children's director. Cheyenne Mackey, who's been to Peru 100 million times, and Africa as well. Shelby Morris, who's helped with Brethren Academy and is a youth leader under David. These are all people who already are in positions of leadership, now looking at, okay, what's the next step here in my life? And we kicked it off last night, and this is another great group to work with. Yeah. And we're going to be spending the next 5 years together, like we did with David and Melanie and the others, just going through everything that needs to be done to help them see, where am I going in this? And I think Melanie, mentioned that, chaplaincy was a big part of her heart. And that's where she was feeling led. And by the time she got through the process, she realized, no, there's more. There's more than that. And now she's a lead pastor at a congregation. So I think just providing the opportunity, it's time consuming for me. I have to reread all those books, listen to all the videos that they're going to listen to, read all of their papers. But it's a commitment that I have made to the brethren and to this congregation and those who are in it for the future of the denomination.
Well, and I think that's right there is one of the keys to being a good leader, is being willing to go through this with them. A lot of times we look at leadership as this upfront kind of thing, and sometimes it's behind pushing the group forward. And one of the things that I've learned through watching Dad lead here at Mount Olive is the importance of building that culture, that team culture, where you're all in this together. I may be the paid staff person, but we're all on the same level, and we're trying to get these kids to understand who Jesus is in their life and what kind of impact he can make in their future. And also, Dad has taught us to keep our eyes open. Sometimes I think as pastors, we can become singularly focused on something, but we need to widen our view to catch those people, be like, man, they'd make a good leader there. Or, man, they got something special about them, and begin to go out and talk. Dad loves to just go up to people and be like, hey, do you play music? Do you sing? Do you want to speak? Like, it's something to build leadership. It's active. You have to go find those leaders. They're not going to come knock on your door and be like, hey, I'd like to lead. Like, That's not how it works. Right. You have to go actively seek them out and then be willing to be there with them as they go through the process.
Yeah, I agree with that. Even now, Fred, if I have a question or something, I'll actually text Fred and say, hey, what do you think about this? Does this sound right to you? So I think that even now, as a leader, I think that's very true. Like David said, we have to be leaders to these people and walk alongside them in the long journey. And Fred's commitment to that is remarkable. And I think that's such a huge thing for me and David, and for everybody else who's going to those classes and is continuing to go through those classes, is Pastor Fred's commitment. And I think that for me and David, watching Fred, David more so than because he was born with him, but the true example to teach us how to be that leader. And like David said, for us to keep our eyes open, because often I'll look in my congregation and go, okay, who's going to read for me on Sunday? Not everybody wants to, but that's what we have to do.
One of the advantages that we've had here is that we have 6 people or more in the reading program, which means we have a class setting. It's not a one-on-one, which I would encourage if that's what you have, one person. But there is a great advantage in having 6 others in the class. And I don't lecture to them just shortly. I have them come and teach. They're going to learn from the beginning. You're going to be doing this for the rest of your life. So we're getting started earlier. And so they would come to class. And having been in seminary myself years ago, that setting was instrumental in my development as a leader, because I was around other people, listening to their thoughts and ideas, which sometimes were different than mine. And this class allowed that iron, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. They were sharpening one another in this process.
Yeah, that's good. There's so many things in there. How many demands there are on a pastor, and how we often, whether bivocational or not, find ourselves. I mean, you, sometimes it's just a matter of getting to the next Sunday, right? Sometimes it's like it's coming whether we're ready or not. So we got to get ready. But all the different areas that you're being pulled in, it's a great reminder not to just be focusing on the tasks in front of us, right? But ministry isn't tasks. Ministry is about relationships and transformation of people. And so, David, the line that you said about just keeping your view wide, seeing on the periphery, I think is a great reminder. Maybe our last question. If you could talk a little bit, David, I know you have your hands in this in a lot of different ways as a youth pastor, and you work with Engage. Talk to me a little bit about, you had said that, there is a little bit of a movement towards giving more of a platform or creating more comfort, whatever language you used, around sort of reorienting younger. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that plays out either at Mount Oliver Liberty or nationally? What is it you see going on, and how can we celebrate those things?
I mean, first of all, Brethren Academy, it was probably, one of the best things we've done on a national level for our youth in quite some time, to offer an opportunity for these young people to go get some specific training on what it means to lead, but what it means to lead Brethren was huge for the kids here, the youth at Mount Olive. I have most of my leadership team is made up of the kids that have attended Brethren Academy from the beginning. And it's been amazing to watch them progress in their faith and their leadership skills. Here at Mount Olive, just giving them opportunity to use those skills and understanding that they may not be as polished as maybe, let's just say me, but also remembering that 7 years ago, I wasn't so polished either. And being okay with that, I guess, discomfort actually can bring about so many great rewards in their leadership skills and development when you just give them the platform to use those gifts. I think the Brethren Church on a national level has begun to do a better job of that. We have a lot of young voices, and we have some older voices that maybe didn't get to use their younger voice like they wanted to, that have great stories and great leadership potential. And we're starting to encourage them in the congregations to allow those people to lead. And just being open and honest with the people about your leadership journey. Like, my leadership team and I are tight. Like, we talk about not just church, we talk about life. And, I'm honest with them about my struggles. I'm honest with them about, my discomforts in ministry and things like that. And having that kind of community, and them seeing, quote unquote, senior leader, maybe dealing with some of the things they're thinking also, kind of puts them at ease and realizing that leadership isn't necessarily perfect. Like I tell people all the time, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And that's kind of how I work with my young leaders. I'm like, he's called you to lead. Now let him work on you and turn you into the leader he wants you to be.
Yeah, it's a great reminder. I remember the first time I preached, it was a disaster. I preached at Five Stones. Half the place was PhDs at the seminary, and I didn't realize it until I got up and preached, and I was terrified. And I preached a 45-minute sermon in like 11 and a half minutes. It was a mess, but it was a safe environment for me to do that. And it built somehow confidence, I've messed up publicly and I lived through it. It's okay. So I think what you're talking about is exactly right. There's got to be opportunity to fall, and have people around to pick you up is critical. That's great.
A couple other people that I would mention here, Justin Morris and Joel Francis, branched off from Mount Olive and planted the Gathering Church. They didn't go, well, Justin did come to the first reading program class. Now he's taking seminary courses. But they grew up in this environment. They heard a call and they planted a church. We had another gentleman by the name of Rich Robertson. Rich I baptized and spent a number of years here. And then Rich moved on and became a pastor in the United Methodist Church. And he'll come back and visit once in a while. He's even volunteered to preach here once in a while. But again, he was in an atmosphere where you were encouraged to at least think about what God might want to do in your life, and if God might want to give you this call. And so I look at what these men are doing, and thank God that they didn't have to go through the reading program. They found another avenue through which they would be able to enter into ministry and work in churches.
We're looking at launching a leadership course here at Mount Olive for those who may not necessarily want to go through the reading program, but know they've been called to serve and lead in their local congregations. Because I think sometimes we forget about that leadership. And that's just as important as the leadership that's paid staff. Not everybody's called to be a pastor, but everybody's called to lead in their local congregation. And so having ways for them to find out what that calling is and ways they can fit into their local congregation, I think helps down the road, because then they might feel the call and you might be looking for somebody to fill a spot, and you've already trained them and have them on their way.
And if you look at our staff here at Mount Olive, Melanie's been a part of that staff, David, Gail, and Laura. Our staff has grown up from within our congregation. David's just been promoted to being the pastor of leadership and spiritual development. So we're looking for a new youth pastor. And, they're not banging on our door here. The search is on, and God will provide that person. But, here's an opportunity at a larger congregation. And we've advertised through the Brethren Church. And again, they're not knocking our doors down. Why? I don't know. I think it's a great opportunity. But it goes back to the very first question, you were addressing. Why do we have a dearth of people going into ministry? And we're not the only ones. You mentioned that. Nope. But you have to find a solution, or you're just going to continue to bring people in from the outside.
Remember, I once heard, I think it was Craig Rochelle. If not, I'm giving him credit for somebody else's stuff. But they were talking about how somebody had remarked to him about, like, man, your church is just so full of such high-level leaders. That must be such a gift. And he said, yeah, where do you think they came from? Like, we built them too. It's not like we just found a shelf with a clearance aisle of great leaders. We built them too. Yeah. And so the things that sound like they're going on at Mount Olive are great and on point, and how leadership gets done, it seems. And so celebrate the work that you folks have done, deeply respectful of just the legacy that has come through there, all the voices that continue to be a part of the Brethren Church. We're grateful for that work. And we just pray blessings over all y'all as you go and do the things you do. And we thank you for your hard work.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Brethren Way Calling Series. If you liked what you heard, please like and subscribe to the Brethren Way podcast so you can catch every episode. If you have any feedback on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Find us on Facebook at The Brethren Church, or email us brethren@brethrenchurch.org to share your thoughts and opinions.